A rancher's knife sliced through rope as a dying Apache girl collapsed into his arms, the hateful sign around her neck reading, "White man too wicked." In that moment, Jacob Whitmore made a choice that would turn an entire territory against him and prove that love could grow in the harshest soil of human cruelty. Before we dive into this story, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's incredible tale of redemption. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. The October wind carried the scent of coming winter through Devil's Canyon when Jacob Whitmore first saw the horror that would change his life forever. He'd been riding the same desolate trail for months now, checking boundary markers on land that felt more like a prison than a home. The territory was unforgiving to men like him, widowers who'd buried their families and kept breathing out of stubborn habit rather than hope. Jacob pulled his horse to a stop beneath the ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching toward heaven like arthritic fingers. Something was wrong with this picture, something that made his gut clench and his hand instinctively move toward his rifle. A small figure hung from the lowest branch, swaying gently in the autumn breeze. Not dead, he realized with a start. The chest was rising and falling, barely, but moving nonetheless. He dismounted and approached cautiously. It was a girl, no more than 11 years old, with long black hair and the copper skin that marked her as Apache. Her wrists were bound with rough rope, her bare feet barely brushing the rocky ground. Around her neck hung a crudely painted wooden sign with words that hit Jacob like a physical blow. "White man too wicked." Jacob's hands trembled as he stared at those words. He'd heard whispers in the saloons of Copper Creek about frontier justice, about messages left for Apache bands that had been raiding settlements. But this wasn't a warrior or a raider. This was a child, unconscious and dying slowly in the high desert air. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Jacob Whitmore stood frozen between two worlds. The smart choice would be to ride away, pretend he'd never seen her. Getting involved with Apache troubles had destroyed other men's lives. The people of Copper Creek had made their position clear about Indians, and Jacob needed their business to keep his struggling ranch alive. But as he looked at her face, peaceful despite the horror of her situation, he saw his own son Ben, dead of cholera these 8 months past. He saw the innocence that someone had decided deserved to die simply for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. His knife was in his hand before he'd made the conscious decision. He cut the rope binding her wrists and caught her small body as she collapsed. She weighed almost nothing, this girl who someone had left as a message of hatred for her people. Her skin burned with fever, and purple bruises marked her throat where the rope had chafed. Jacob cradled her against his chest and felt something crack open inside him that had been sealed shut since Sarah and Ben died. This child would not die today, not while he had breath in his body, not while there was still decency left in this godforsaken world. He mounted his horse with careful movements, holding her close, and turned toward his cabin in the hills. Behind them, the sign swayed empty in the desert wind, its message of hate echoing across the canyon. But Jacob Whitmore was no longer listening to the voices of fear and vengeance. For the first time in months, he was listening to something that sounded almost like his conscience awakening from a long, bitter sleep. The girl's eyes snapped open like a trapped animal's, wide with terror that cut straight through Jacob's soul. She tried to bolt upright from his bed but collapsed back with a gasp of pain, her gaze darting frantically around the small cabin. Rough wooden walls, a stone fireplace, simple furniture that spoke of a man living alone. When her dark eyes found Jacob sitting motionless in the corner chair, she pressed herself against the headboard as if she could melt into the wood itself. "Easy now," Jacob said softly, keeping his weathered hands visible and still. "You're safe here." She spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice hoarse and desperate, words that Jacob couldn't understand but whose meaning was crystal clear. Fear, confusion, the expectation of violence that had been beaten into her young soul. Jacob rose slowly from his chair, and she flinched as if anticipating a blow. The reaction hit him like a physical punch to the chest. What horrors had this child witnessed to make her expect cruelty from every human gesture? "I won't hurt you," he said, though he knew she couldn't comprehend his words. He pointed to himself. "Jacob," then to her, raising his eyebrows in question. She shook her head frantically, pulling the rough wool blanket up to her chin. Her breathing came quick and shallow, the breathing of someone ready to run or fight despite her weakness. Jacob moved to the kitchen area with deliberate slowness, every motion calculated to appear non-threatening. He ladled water into a tin cup and placed it on the small table beside the bed, then stepped back several paces. The girl watched his every movement with the intensity of prey studying a predator. The hours crawled by in this delicate dance of approach and retreat. Jacob tended to simple chores while she observed him, gradually understanding that he posed no immediate danger. When he heated beans and cornbread over the fire, the aroma made her stomach growl audibly. He served the food in a wooden bowl and set it beside the water, then retreated to give her space. She didn't touch the meal at first, but eventually hunger conquered caution. She ate like someone who hadn't seen proper food in days, which Jacob suspected was painfully true. As she ate, some of the rigid terror left her small shoulders. "Kaya," she said suddenly, startling them both with the sound of her own voice. She touched her chest. "Kaya, Kaya," Jacob repeated carefully, trying to honor the musical quality of the name. Something that might have been the ghost of a smile flickered across her face when he pronounced it correctly. As afternoon faded to evening, fragments of communication began forming between them. Jacob would point to objects and speak the English word. Sometimes Kaya would offer the Apache equivalent. Water became tu. Fire became ko. Simple gestures became bridges across the vast canyon between their worlds. When darkness fell and Jacob prepared his bedroll by the fireplace, Kaya spoke again. This time the words came haltingly, in broken English that surprised him with its existence. "Soldiers, come to my village," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames. "Kill all my people. Mother, father, little brother. All dead." The simple words struck Jacob like bullets. He'd heard reports of military actions against Apache bands, but hearing it from this child's lips made the horror real in a way newspaper accounts never could. "Your family?" he asked gently, though he already knew the answer. Kaya's composure crumbled, and she nodded through tears that had been held back too long. "Hide in rocks when shooting start. Watch them die. Watch them burn our homes." Jacob felt his own eyes burn with unshed tears. He thought of Sarah, of holding his wife as cholera stole her breath, of little Ben's fevered last words. Different deaths, same crushing grief. "I lost my family too," he found himself saying. "My wife Sarah and my boy Ben. Sickness took them last winter." Kaya looked at him with new understanding, pain recognizing pain across the barriers of language and culture. For the first time since he'd cut her down from that tree, Jacob saw something besides terror in her dark eyes. He saw a recognition of shared loss, the beginning of trust born from mutual understanding of what it meant to have your entire world torn away in a single, devastating blow. That night, as Jacob lay listening to Kaya's quiet breathing, he realized something fundamental had shifted in his existence. For 8 months he'd been merely surviving, going through the motions of life without purpose or hope. Now, protecting this broken child had awakened something he thought had died with his family. A reason to face tomorrow. For days passed before Kaya ventured beyond the cabin doorway. Jacob had been repairing a broken wagon wheel on the porch when she appeared like a cautious deer testing the safety of open meadow. The morning sun caught the fading bruises around her throat, purple reminders of how close death had claimed her. "Good morning, Kaya," Jacob said without looking up from his work, giving her space to make her own choices about trust. She stepped onto the wooden porch and settled on the edge, far enough to flee if needed, but close enough to watch his weathered hands guide the tools. Jacob had learned that sudden movements still startled her, that raised voices made her flinch, that trust was measured in heartbeats and careful gestures. "You teach me this?" she asked, pointing to the wheel repair. Her English improved daily, words blooming like desert flowers after rare rain. Jacob smiled and patted the space beside him on the workbench. "Come here, child. I'll show you how it's done." As he guided her small hands through the process of fitting iron to wood, Jacob marveled at how quickly she absorbed new skills. Her fingers were nimble and sure, her attention complete. When she successfully secured a loose spoke, her face lit with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. Kaya means elder sister in my language, she said suddenly as they worked together. My grandmother say I would take care of others, be strong like mountain that stands against storms. Your grandmother sounds wise, Jacob replied. Tell me about her. Kaya's expression grew distant, touched with the bittersweet ache of cherished memories. She teach me plants that heal, songs that call rain, stories of our people. She say Apache women are backbone of the world. She was right about you being strong, Jacob observed. You've survived things that would break grown men. The child's face clouded as darker memories surfaced. When soldiers come, I was gathering berries with my little brother Nate. We hear shooting, screaming. I tell him hide in rocks, but he too scared. He run toward village. Her voice broke. Soldiers shoot him down like rabbit. He only 6 winters old. Jacob's hands stilled on the wheel, his heart clenching at the raw pain in her voice. The senseless cruelty of it burned in his chest like swallowed fire. After all dead, I walk many days. No food, little water. People from town catch me near their water well. They angry, say Apache killed their friends in raids. But we no raid anyone. We only hunt and gather like always. Tell me about the sign, Jacob said gently. How did you end up in that tree? Kaya's voice became very quiet, distant. Town people say Apache are all same, all murderers. Put rope around my neck, hang sign to send message to my people. Say next Apache they catch, they kill slow. She shrugged with the terrible acceptance of someone too young to understand such hatred. They think fear will stop raids, but raids not from my band. Jacob set down his tools and turned to face her fully. Listen to me, Kaya. You are not responsible for what others do. You are your own person, with your own heart and mind. Anyone who can't see that is blind and foolish. She studied his face as if memorizing every line and weathered crease. Why you save me? Your people hate mine. You could have big trouble for helping Apache girl. The question hung between them like morning mist, demanding honest answer. Jacob had wrestled with it during sleepless nights, had tried to justify his actions with logic and reason. But the truth was both simpler and more complex than any explanation. Because leaving you there would have been wrong, he said finally. Because you reminded me that there's still good in this world worth protecting. Because you're just a child who deserves a chance to grow up. Over the following days, their routine expanded naturally. Kaya helped with ranch chores, feeding chickens, gathering eggs, tending the small vegetable garden behind the cabin. She moved with the quiet grace of someone raised in harmony with the natural world, able to calm nervous horses with gentle words and predict weather changes by reading cloud patterns. In the evenings, they sat by the fire trading stories and languages. Jacob told her about Sarah, how they'd met in Kansas and dreamed of building something lasting in the territory. Kaya shared Apache legends about changing woman and the sacred directions, stories her grandmother had whispered during long winter nights. My people say Earth is our mother, she explained one evening as stars emerged above the canyon. We take only what we need, give thanks for what we receive. Your people take everything, even when they have plenty. Jacob couldn't argue with her observation. He'd seen the mining operations that scarred entire mountainsides, the cattle that stripped grasslands bare, the settlements that claimed water rights for miles in every direction. Not all my people think that way, he said. Some of us understand we're guests here, not owners. Kaya looked at him with something that might have been hope. Maybe that why you different. Maybe that why Creator put you in Canyon that day. As autumn deepened around their isolated cabin, Jacob realized something profound had shifted in his existence. The crushing loneliness that had defined his days since burying Sarah and Ben had lifted like morning fog. Kaya's presence filled the small space with life, with purpose, with sounds of laughter he'd forgotten how to make. For the first time since losing his family, Jacob Whitmore felt truly alive rather than merely surviving from one empty day to the next. The first warning came with the November frost. Jacob was splitting firewood behind the cabin when he heard the unmistakable sound of approaching riders. Three men emerged from the pine trees, their faces grim beneath wide-brimmed hats. Jacob recognized them immediately. Mayor Harrison Reed from Copper Creek, Sheriff Tom Bradley, and Reed's ranch foreman Pete Kowalski. None looked like they'd come for social pleasantries. Kaya appeared in the cabin doorway, but Jacob caught her eye and shook his head slightly. She melted back into the shadows with the instinctive caution of someone who'd learned that survival often depended on remaining invisible. "Afternoon, Jacob," Mayor Reed called out, his voice carrying the weight of official business. "Mind if we have a word?" Jacob leaned his axe against the woodpile and walked toward them, keeping his movements casual despite the tension coiling in his gut. "Harrison, Sheriff, what brings you gentlemen all the way out here?" Reed dismounted and took several steps closer, his merchant's face set in lines of practiced authority. "We've been hearing disturbing reports, Jacob. Stories about you harboring an Apache child on your property. Is that so?" Jacob kept his voice level, neutral. He'd known this confrontation was inevitable, but he'd hoped for more time to figure out how to protect Kaya. Sheriff Bradley shifted in his saddle, his hand resting near his gun belt. "Don't play ignorant with us, Whitmore. Half the territory knows you've got one of them living here. People are asking questions, and they're not happy with the answers." "What kind of questions?" Jacob asked, though he suspected he already knew. Reed's face hardened with righteous conviction. "The kind that wonder if you're in contact with hostile bands. The kind that ask whether that Apache girl is passing information about our defenses, our patrol schedules, our weak spots." The accusation hit Jacob like a slap. "She's 11 years old, Harrison. The only information she has is about losing her entire family to cavalry bullets. Apache children grow up to be Apache warriors." Kowalski spat from his saddle. "They teach them to hate us from the cradle. You're being played for a fool, Whitmore." Jacob felt anger rising in his chest like floodwater. "The girl I found was half dead and alone. Her family was massacred by soldiers. She's no threat to anyone." "That's not your decision to make," Sheriff Bradley said, his badge catching the afternoon light. "The territorial government has clear policies about dealing with hostile Indians. We're here to collect her for proper authorities." "Proper authorities?" Jacob's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm. "You mean the same authorities who hung her from a tree with a sign around her neck?" The three men exchanged glances, and Jacob saw something flicker in Reed's eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps even shame, quickly buried beneath stubborn conviction. "That was unfortunate," Reed admitted. "Some of our citizens got carried away after the Martinez ranch was hit. But the fact remains that Apache raids have increased since that girl arrived in the area." "Correlation isn't causation," Jacob said. "Those raids could be from any band. Kaya's people are all dead." "So she claims," Kowalski sneered. "Apache are natural liars, Whitmore. It's in their blood." The casual racism made Jacob's hands clench into fists. He thought of Kaya's tears when she spoke of her family, of the nightmares that still woke her in the middle of the night, of the gentle way she handled injured animals and spoke to the horses. "You don't know what you're talking about," Jacob said quietly, his voice carrying more threat than any shout. Reed stepped closer, lowering his voice to what he probably thought was a reasonable tone. "Look, Jacob, I understand you feel sorry for the girl. It's natural for a man who's lost his own children. But you're putting the entire community at risk." "How exactly am I doing that?" "By showing weakness," Reed said bluntly. "By demonstrating that our people can be manipulated by a few tears and a sad story. Word of your charity has spread beyond Copper Creek. Other Apache bands know there's a white man who'll protect their young. What message does that send?" Jacob stared at the three men, seeing in their faces the fear and hatred that had poisoned the territory for decades. They weren't evil men, necessarily, but they were men who'd let fear transform them into something ugly. "The message it sends," Jacob said slowly, "is that not all white men are monsters. That some of us still remember what it means to be human." Sheriff Bradley's face flushed red. "Damn it, Whitmore, this isn't about being human. This is about survival. about protecting our families and our way of life. By murdering children? By dealing with threats before they become bigger threats, Reed interjected. Jacob, you've got 3 days to think this over. After that, we come back with federal backing and take the girl by force. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. As the three men mounted their horses, Jacob felt the world shifting beneath his feet. The isolation he'd chosen after Sarah and Ben's death had protected him from the ugliness of frontier politics. Now that protection was gone, and he was forced to confront the reality of what his neighbors had become. One more thing, Reed called out as they prepared to leave. Your credit at Patterson's store has been suspended. Same with the feed mill and the grain elevator. Business owners are concerned about their reputations. The economic threat was clear and immediate. Jacob's ranch depended on good relationships with Copper Creek suppliers for survival. Without access to goods and services, he'd be forced to abandon the property within months. From inside the cabin, Jacob heard the soft sound of a door closing. Kaya had been listening, understanding enough to know these men had come for her. His heart ached knowing she was probably preparing to run again, to face the wilderness alone rather than bring destruction to the man who'd saved her. As the riders disappeared into the trees, Jacob stood in his yard watching dust settle in their wake. The autumn wind carried the scent of coming winter, of changes that couldn't be stopped or turned back. Inside the cabin, Kaya waited in silence, and Jacob knew the hardest test of his life was approaching with the inevitability of a desert storm. That evening, Jacob found Kaya packing her few belongings into a worn cloth bundle. She moved with quiet efficiency, like someone who'd learned to travel light and disappear quickly. The sight of her preparing to leave tore at something deep in his chest. Where do you think you're going? He asked from the doorway. She didn't look up from her packing. I bring trouble to you. Better I leave before bad things happen. Jacob crossed the room and gently placed his weathered hand over her small ones, stopping her movements. The only trouble here is men who've forgotten the difference between right and wrong. You're not going anywhere. They will hurt you because of me, she said, finally meeting his eyes. I see this before. Good white people suffer when they help Apache. Better I go back to desert. And do what? Die alone out there. Jacob's voice was fiercer than he intended. This is your home now, Kaya. I protect what's mine. The word mine surprised them both. Not ownership, but belonging. Family. The bond that had grown between them through shared meals and quiet conversations. Kaya's eyes filled with tears, she quickly blinked away. The next morning brought the first taste of how serious Reed's threats would become. Jacob rode into Copper Creek for supplies and found Patterson's general store locked tight, though he could see the owner inside serving other customers. Down the street, other shop doors closed as he approached, owners suddenly too busy to conduct business. At Murphy's Feed and Grain, the Irish immigrant was more direct about the situation. I'm sorry, Jacob, he said, his accent thick with genuine regret. Harrison Reed came by yesterday with a list of names. Said anyone who does business with you is supporting hostile Indians against the community. Jacob understood. These weren't evil men, just frightened people trying to protect their families in a land where community support meant survival. But understanding didn't make the rejection hurt any less. The isolation was swift and brutal. By the second day, Jacob's credit had been canceled at every establishment in town. His mail stopped being delivered. Men who'd shared drinks with him at the Silver Dollar Saloon now crossed the street to avoid him. The message was crystal clear: abandon the Apache girl or be cast out entirely. But worse news was coming. Doc Morrison rode out to the ranch that afternoon, his medical bag bouncing against his saddle, his face grim with concern. Jacob, I need to warn you about something, he said as soon as he dismounted. Reed's been talking to some of the younger men around town. Hotheads looking for excitement and a chance to prove themselves. Jacob felt ice forming in his stomach. What kind of excitement? The kind that involves torches and rope, Doc said grimly. They're calling themselves the Citizens Protection Committee. Reeds filled their heads with stories about Apache spies and imminent raids. Says you're harboring intelligence for hostile bands. From the cabin window, Kaya watched their conversation with growing alarm. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the tension in their postures, the gravity etched into their faces. "How many men?" Jacob asked. "Maybe a dozen. Most of them boys who've never seen real violence, which makes them more dangerous, not less. They're all fired up with righteous anger and whiskey courage." Doc paused, studying Jacob's face. "Reed's convinced them that making an example of you and the girl will send a message to other Apache bands. Deter future raids." That evening, Jacob began preparing for the inevitable. He cleaned his rifles, counted his ammunition, and planned escape routes through the maze of canyons behind his ranch. He taught Kaya hand signals for danger, showed her hiding places among the rocks where she could wait if violence came. "You really think they come for us?" she asked as they shared what might be their last peaceful dinner together. Jacob looked across the table at this brave girl who'd already survived more loss and violence than most adults would face in a lifetime. Her dark eyes held wisdom beyond her years, the kind that came from witnessing too much of the world's cruelty too young. "I think some men would rather destroy something good than admit they were wrong," he said. "But I also think we're stronger than they know." Kaya nodded solemnly. "My grandmother always say that strongest trees grow in hardest ground. Maybe we are like those trees." As darkness fell over the canyon, Jacob made his final preparations. He moved extra ammunition to strategic locations around the cabin, filled water barrels, and checked the sturdy bar that could secure the door. Most importantly, he went over the escape plan with Kaya one more time, making sure she knew exactly where to go if things went badly. "Promise me something," he said as they prepared for what might be their last night of peace. "If shooting starts, you run. Don't look back. Don't try to help. Just run and survive." Kaya shook her head firmly. "I no run anymore. We are family now. Families stick together." That night, Jacob lay awake listening to every sound outside the cabin. The wind through the pines, the distant howl of coyotes, the soft settling of the house as temperatures dropped. Somewhere out there, men were gathering, fueled by fear and hatred, preparing to ride against a man and child whose only crime was showing each other kindness. But Jacob Whitmore was no longer the broken widower who'd found Kaya hanging from that oak tree. Caring for her had awakened something in him that he thought had died with Sarah and Ben. A fierce protective instinct burned in his chest, brighter than any torch the vigilantes might carry. They would come, he was certain of that now, and when they did, they would discover that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost to himself. They came in the darkness before dawn, just as Jacob had expected. 12 riders emerged from the pine shadows like specters of the territory's violent past, their faces masked with bandanas, torches casting dancing shadows across the frost-covered ground. Jacob watched them approach from his position behind the cabin's thick log walls, his rifle loaded and ready. Kaya crouched safely behind the stone fireplace. Harrison Reed led the group, unmistakable despite his mask, flanked by his foreman Kowalski and a collection of young men whose names Jacob knew from town. Tommy Patterson, barely 19 and eager to prove his courage. The Brennan twins, whose Irish immigrant parents had fled violence in the old country only to see their sons embrace it in the new. Others whose families Jacob had helped during harsh winters and dry summers. Jacob Whitmore. Reed's voice carried across the yard, artificially deepened to sound more threatening. "We know you're in there. Come out and bring the Apache girl. Time to settle this business once and for all." Jacob remained silent, watching their positions, counting weapons. They'd spread out in a rough semicircle around the cabin, cutting off obvious escape routes, but leaving gaps a man could exploit if he knew the terrain well enough. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Whitmore," Kowalski shouted. "Just hand over the savage and we'll be on our way. Nobody needs to get hurt tonight." From behind the fireplace, Kaya's voice was barely a whisper. "Let me go to them. I don't want you hurt because of me." "Not happening," Jacob replied quietly. "We stick together, remember?" Reed tried a different approach, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of a businessman closing a deal. "Jacob, think about what you're doing. That girl represents everything that's wrong with this territory. The raids, the killings, the fear our families live with every day. By protecting her, you're choosing their side over ours. I'm choosing right over wrong, Jacob called back, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. Something you boys seem to have forgotten how to do. The insult struck home. Several of the younger men shifted restlessly in their saddles, hands moving toward weapons. Jacob could feel the tension building like pressure before a thunderstorm. Last chance, Whitmore, Reed declared. Bring out the girl, or we come in and get her ourselves. Come ahead, Jacob replied. But understand that the first man through that door won't be riding home tonight. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. 12 armed men against one, with an innocent child's life hanging in the balance. Jacob could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, but his hands remained steady on his rifle. He'd faced Confederate cavalry charges during the war, had stared death in the face before. This felt different, more personal, because this time he wasn't just fighting for country or cause, but for family. Then young Tommy Patterson made the first move, spurring his horse forward with the reckless bravery of youth. Enough talking. Let's finish this. His charge broke the spell that had held the others in check. The night exploded into chaos as men drew weapons and horses plunged forward. Jacob's first shot took Patterson in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. But then the cabin walls erupted in splinters as return fire poured in from multiple directions. Stay down, Jacob shouted to Kaya as he rolled to a new position, trying to keep the thick logs between himself and the attackers. Bullets whined overhead, thudding into the wooden walls and shattering the cabin's single window. Outside, Reed was trying to restore order to his vigilantes, but the violence had taken on a life of its own. Some of the men had dismounted and were trying to storm the cabin directly, while others provided covering fire from horseback. In the chaos of muzzle flashes and shouting voices, Jacob caught glimpses of faces he'd known for years, transformed by fear and hatred into something unrecognizable. A burning torch arced through the broken window, landing near the wooden table. Kaya darted from her hiding place to stamp out the flames before they could spread, her quick action probably saving their lives. In that moment, Jacob saw not a frightened child but a warrior, someone who'd inherited the courage of her people along with their suffering. The back wall, Kaya called out, pointing to where smoke was beginning to seep through the chinking between logs. They try to burn us out. Jacob fired through a gap in the logs, driving back 2 men who'd been approaching with more torches. But he could see their strategy now. If they couldn't force their way inside, they'd turn the cabin into a funeral pyre and solve their Apache problem permanently. As smoke began to fill the small space, Jacob made a desperate decision. Kaya, when I give the signal, you run for the rocks behind the cabin. Don't stop, don't look back, just run. No, she said firmly, picking up a fallen piece of burning wood and holding it like a weapon. We fight together or we die together. I no run anymore. Her courage humbled and terrified him in equal measure. This child who'd already lost everything was prepared to make a stand rather than abandon the man who'd chosen to protect her. In her dark eyes, Jacob saw the strength her grandmother had predicted, the eternal blossom that could bloom even in the harshest ground. Outside, Reed's voice cut through the chaos. Burn them out. End this madness now. As flames began to lick at the cabin's walls and smoke made breathing difficult, Jacob realized they had perhaps minutes before their sanctuary became their tomb. But looking at Kaya's determined face in the flickering firelight, he felt something he hadn't experienced since the war, the kind of fierce pride that came from standing beside someone willing to die for what was right, regardless of the odds against them. The sound that cut through the gunfire and shouting was unlike anything the vigilantes had expected to hear. War cries echoed off the canyon walls, high and piercing, followed by the thunder of unshod hooves on rocky ground. Reed's men turned toward the sound with faces gone pale in the torchlight, their righteous courage evaporating as they saw what was bearing down on them through the darkness. 7 Apache warriors emerged from the shadows like vengeful spirits, painted for war and armed with both traditional weapons and captured army rifles. At their head rode a man Jacob had never seen before, older than the others, with silver threading through his long black hair and eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent fighting for survival in an unforgiving world. The vigilantes' confident aggression collapsed instantly. Whatever they'd expected when they rode out that night, facing actual Apache warriors hadn't been part of their plan. Several of the younger men looked ready to bolt for their horses, their earlier bravado forgotten in the face of real danger. "Nobody move," the lead Apache called out in clear, unaccented English, his rifle trained on Reed. "We came here following the sound of guns and the smell of smoke. Lower your weapons and step away from that cabin." Reed, bleeding from a graze on his cheek where Jacob's return fire had found its mark, tried to maintain some authority. "This is territorial land, and this is territorial business. You have no right to interfere." The Apache leader's face remained impassive as stone. "I have every right to protect my granddaughter." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. "Granddaughter?" Through the smoke-hazed doorway, he saw Kaya's face transform with shocked recognition and desperate hope. "Grandfather?" she called out in Apache, her voice breaking with emotion. "Grandfather Nayeli, is it really you?" The old warrior's composure cracked slightly at the sound of her voice. "Kaya, child of my heart, we have searched for you since the soldiers came to our village." As the reunion unfolded, Doc Morrison appeared at the edge of the firelight, his medical bag bouncing against his hip as his horse picked its way carefully between the armed men. Behind him rode Father O'Brien from the Mission Church, his presence adding another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. "Gentlemen, lower your weapons," Doc commanded with the authority of a man who'd patched up half the territory and buried the other half. "There's been enough violence for one night." Reed, still trying to salvage some control from the disaster his vigilante action had become, gestured toward the Apache warriors. "Doc, these are hostile Indians on territorial land. The army needs to be notified immediately." "Actually," Father O'Brien said quietly, dismounting and approaching with his hands visible and empty. "Chief Nayeli and his people have been in communication with territorial authorities for weeks. They've been seeking safe passage to the reservation, trying to arrange protection for the survivors of their band." The revelation struck the vigilantes like cold water. Their righteous mission to protect the territory from hostile Indians had just become an attack on people actively cooperating with the government toward peace. Young Patterson, clutching his wounded shoulder, spoke up from where he'd fallen. We didn't know. Reed told us they were all hostiles, all dangerous." Chief Nayeli's gaze moved from the wounded boy to Reed with something that might have been pity. "Fear makes men do foolish things. But ignorance is no excuse for cruelty to children." As the immediate threat of violence receded, Jacob emerged from the smoke-filled cabin with Kaya close behind him. The reunion between granddaughter and grandfather was brief but profound, conducted in rapid Apache punctuated by tears and embraces that spoke louder than words. Doc Morrison immediately went to work on the wounded, treating Patterson's shoulder while examining Jacob for injuries. "You're lucky," he told Jacob. "Few inches lower, and that bullet would have found something vital." But the most significant revelation was yet to come. Chief Nayeli, still holding Kaya's hand as if afraid she might disappear again, turned to address the assembled men. "3 months ago, soldiers came to our camp," he said, his English carefully measured but devastatingly clear. "They said we had stolen cattle, attacked settlers. This was not true. We were gathering winter food, preparing for cold season. But the soldier chief, he wanted our land for his friends who raise cattle." Reed's face had gone ashen. "What soldier chief?" "Captain Morrison Hayes from Fort Bayard. He told his men we were hostiles who must be eliminated. When some of our warriors tried to surrender, he ordered them shot down. Then he burned our village and took our horses to sell." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the territory knew Captain Hayes, knew his reputation for aggressive action against Apache bands. But this painted a picture of corruption and murder for profit that turned heroic Indian fighter into something much darker. Father O'Brien spoke into the silence. "Chief Nayeli has been trying to reach territorial authorities with evidence of Captain Hayes' crimes. He has witnesses, survivors who can testify to what really happened. Why should we believe Apache testimony against a United States officer? Kowalski demanded, though his voice lacked conviction. Because, Doc Morrison said grimly, Captain Hayes has been selling army horses to buyers in El Paso. I've seen the brands myself. And because 3 other Apache bands have made similar accusations about unprovoked attacks followed by land grabs. As dawn began to break over the canyon, painting the sky pale gold above the smoke-stained cabin, the vigilantes found themselves in an impossible position. Their righteous crusade against Apache hostiles had crumbled into something that looked suspiciously like participation in a cover-up of military corruption and mass murder. Reed, his authority evaporating with the morning mist, began backing toward his horse. This changes things. We need to report this to territorial authorities. Yes, Chief Naeli said with quiet dignity. Truth has a way of demanding to be heard, no matter how long men try to silence it. As the vigilantes departed, their torches extinguished and their cause in ruins, Jacob stood beside Kaya and her grandfather, watching the sun rise over a world that had changed irrevocably in the space of a single violent night. The days that followed the confrontation passed like a dream suspended between 2 worlds. Chief Naeli and his warriors made camp in the meadow below Jacob's cabin, close enough to protect Kaya, but far enough to avoid alarming any passing travelers. The arrangement felt fragile, temporary, like morning frost that would vanish with the first strong wind. Jacob watched from his porch as Kaya moved between the 2 camps, spending mornings with him learning to read from Sarah's old books, then afternoons with her Apache family relearning songs and stories she'd begun to forget. Her face glowed with joy at reconnecting with her heritage, but Jacob could see the growing conflict in her dark eyes with each passing day. On the 3rd evening, Chief Naeli approached the cabin alone. Jacob was attempting to repair fire damage to the cabin wall one-handed, his wounded shoulder still weak but healing. The old Apache leader moved with the quiet grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading the wilderness for signs of danger. Your arm mends well, Naeli observed in his careful English. Doc Morrison knows his business, Jacob replied, setting down his hammer. Coffee's hot if you'd like some. They sat on the damaged porch in comfortable silence for a while. 2 men who'd both lost everything and found themselves responsible for protecting what remained. The sunset painted the canyon walls deep red and gold, beauty that seemed to mock the ugliness of human conflict. She speaks of you often, Naeli said finally. In our camp, she tells stories of the white man who cut her down from the hanging tree, who showed her kindness when the world showed only cruelty. Jacob felt his throat tighten. She's a remarkable girl, strong like you taught her to be. You knew my wife? Naeli's eyebrows rose slightly. Kaya told me about her grandmother, about the woman who said she would be like an eternal blossom, growing strong even in hard places. Jacob paused, choosing his words carefully. She also told me her grandmother died trying to protect children who couldn't run fast enough. Naeli's weathered face darkened with old grief. My wife was a medicine woman, a keeper of our sacred stories. The soldiers shot her while she was singing death songs for the children they had already killed. She died as she lived, putting others before herself. The weight of shared loss settled between them like gathering dusk. Jacob understood now why Kaya carried herself with such dignity despite her youth. She came from people who faced death with courage, who measured worth by how much love they could give rather than how much they could take. What will you do now? Jacob asked. Doc says the territorial investigation is making progress. We will go to the reservation, Naeli said with the resignation of someone whose choices had been steadily narrowed by circumstances beyond his control. It is not the life we would choose, but it is life. Our children will grow up knowing they are Apache, even if they cannot live as Apache always lived. And Kaya? The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Naeli studied Jacob's face carefully before answering, reading the hope and fear written there in equal measure. By Apache law, she belongs with her blood family. She is the last child of my daughter's daughter, precious beyond words. He paused. His next words weighted with careful consideration. But Apache law also teaches that children belong where they can grow strong, where they are loved and can learn to love in return. Over the following week, the tension in Kaya became impossible to ignore. She grew quiet during meals, spent long hours staring at the mountains, started at sudden sounds. Jacob recognized the signs of someone wrestling with an impossible choice, torn between loyalty and love, between blood and belonging. The crisis came when a cavalry patrol rode through, ostensibly investigating the reports of Indian activity in the area. The lieutenant in charge was young and ambitious, the kind of officer who saw career advancement in decisive action against hostiles. When he learned about the Apache camp, his interest sharpened dangerously. Unauthorized Indians on territorial land, he declared to Jacob. They need to be escorted to the reservation immediately, regardless of any civilian investigations. They're cooperating with territorial authorities, Jacob protested. Chief Naeli is a key witness in the Captain Hayes investigation. I have my orders, the lieutenant replied coldly. All Apache found off reservation land are to be considered potentially hostile and dealt with accordingly. That night, Naeli came to the cabin with grim news. The soldiers will return tomorrow with more men. We must leave before dawn or face another massacre. Kaya sat by the fire, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. The choice she'd been avoiding could no longer be delayed. Go with her Apache family into an uncertain future on the reservation, or stay with Jacob and lose her connection to her people forever. What does your heart tell you? Jacob asked gently, kneeling beside her chair despite the pain in his wounded shoulder. My heart is broken in pieces, she whispered. With you, I am safe and loved and can learn the white man's ways. With my grandfather, I am Apache and can honor the memory of those who died. How do I choose between these things? Jacob took her small hands in his weathered ones, feeling the tremor of her internal struggle. Maybe you don't have to choose, little one. Love doesn't end because of distance. And being Apache isn't something that can be taken away by where you sleep at night. Naeli spoke from the doorway, his voice gentle with understanding. The white man speaks wisdom, granddaughter. You will always be Apache, whether you live in our camp or his cabin. The blood of warriors and medicine women flows in your veins. Distance cannot change that. In the firelight, with the two men who loved her most watching with patient hearts, Kaya made her choice. It was not the choice Jacob had hoped for, nor the one Naeli expected. It was something entirely her own, born from the strength her grandmother had planted in her like a seed that had grown through suffering into something beautiful and unbreakable. I want to stay with Jacob, she said quietly, but I also want to learn the old ways from my grandfather. In the time before soldiers and reservations, Apache children sometimes lived with different families, learning from many teachers. Can I not have both worlds? The simplicity of her solution took both men by surprise. In her child's wisdom, she had found a path that honored both love and heritage, that refused to accept that she must choose between being Apache and being loved by the man who'd saved her life. Kaya's wisdom surprised everyone, including herself. As the fire crackled in the cabin that final night before the cavalry's return, she looked between Jacob and her grandfather Naeli, her young face showing a maturity that humbled both men. In the old days, she continued, Apache children learned from many teachers. Grandfathers taught hunting, grandmothers taught healing, aunts and uncles taught different skills. Maybe the old ways are still the best ways. Naeli smiled for the first time since arriving at the ranch, his weathered face creasing with something that looked almost like relief. She speaks truth. Among our people, it was considered good fortune for a child to have many families, many sources of wisdom. And so they crafted a solution that honored both worlds. Kaya would remain with Jacob as his adopted daughter, but she would spend summers with Naeli's people on the reservation, learning Apache customs, language, and the sacred stories that connected her to generations of ancestors. It was unconventional, requiring letters to territorial officials and careful navigation of bureaucratic waters that Doc Morrison and Father O'Brien promised to handle. The morning Naeli's band prepared to depart, the goodbye was bittersweet but not final. Kaya stood between Jacob and her grandfather, holding both their hands as they made promises about visits and letters, about keeping connections strong across the miles that would separate them. "You take care of our little flower," Nayeli told Jacob, using the English translation of Kaya's name. "Help her grow strong in both worlds. And you," he said to Kaya, "remember that you carry the spirits of all who came before you. Honor them, but do not let their sorrows become your prison." As the Apache riders disappeared into the morning mist, Jacob felt Kaya's small hand slip into his. They stood together watching until the last horse vanished among the trees, then turned back toward their cabin, their life, their future together. The months that followed brought changes Jacob never could have imagined. The investigation into Captain Hay's corruption gained momentum as more Apache survivors came forward with testimony. The captain was eventually court-martialed and sentenced to military prison, though that justice came too late for the families he destroyed in his greed for land and profit. The confrontation with Reed's vigilantes had shifted something fundamental in the community's perception of the situation. Doc Morrison made sure everyone in Copper Creek knew the truth about what had happened, how close they'd come to participating in a cover-up of mass murder. Father O'Brien began including Apache children in his mission school lessons, teaching tolerance alongside arithmetic. Jacob's ranch slowly emerged from its isolation. Klaus Weber at the feed store was the first to restore trade relations, bringing supplies with genuine apologies for his earlier refusal to serve them. Other businesses followed, some driven by conscience, others by the practical realization that Jacob's story was spreading beyond Copper Creek, attracting attention from territorial newspapers and even Eastern publications interested in stories of frontier redemption. But the most profound change was in Jacob himself. The bitter loneliness that had defined his existence since losing Sarah and Ben had been replaced by purpose, by the daily joy of watching Kaya grow and learn. She threw herself into her studies with remarkable intensity, mastering reading and writing with a hunger that spoke to years of lost opportunities. In the evenings, she would practice the Apache songs Nayeli had taught her before leaving, her clear voice carrying across the canyon like a bridge between past and future. Jacob learned to appreciate the haunting beauty of the melodies, even when he couldn't understand the words that spoke of sacred mountains and ancient ceremonies. Spring brought their first test of the new arrangement. Kaya was to spend 2 months with her Apache family, helping with the spring planting and participating in coming-of-age ceremonies for girls her age. Jacob packed her few belongings with hands that trembled slightly, his heart heavy with the familiar fear of loss. "You'll write to me?" he asked for the 10th time as they prepared for the journey to the reservation. "Every week," she promised, hugging him tightly. "And you must write back, even if your letters are terrible and your spelling is worse." The weeks of her absence stretched long for Jacob, filled with silences he'd forgotten how to bear. But her letters came regularly, filled with stories of desert plants that could heal wounds, of ceremonies that connected the living to the spirits of ancestors, of young Apache women who were becoming her friends and teachers. When she returned in late summer, Jacob could see the change in her immediately. She carried herself with new confidence, spoke with quiet authority about things she'd learned, wore traditional Apache jewelry alongside the simple dress he'd bought her in town. She was becoming herself in the fullest sense, drawing strength from both worlds without being trapped by either. The legal adoption was finalized that fall, with Doc Morrison serving as witness and Father O'Brien providing character testimony. Judge Harrison, a practical man who'd seen too much frontier violence, was impressed by the unusual arrangement. "Most irregular situation," he admitted, "but the child appears healthy, well-educated, and remarkably mature for her age. And frankly, Mr. Whitmore, the territory could use more examples of cooperation between communities rather than the endless cycle of revenge we've been witnessing." As winter approached, Jacob and Kaya settled into routines that felt as natural as breathing. She helped with ranch work in the mornings, studied in the afternoons, and spent evenings teaching Jacob Apache words while he helped her with geography and mathematics. They were building something new together, a family that honored the past while embracing the future. On quiet evenings by the fire, Jacob sometimes thought about the sign that had hung around Kaya's neck that terrible day in Devil's Canyon. White man too wicked. The words had been meant as a condemnation, a declaration that some wounds could never heal, some hatred never be overcome. But looking at Kaya as she bent over her books, seeing the peace and purpose that had replaced the terror in her dark eyes, Jacob knew the sign's author had been wrong. Wickedness was a choice, and so was redemption. Love was stronger than hate. If people were brave enough to choose it, to nurture it, to let it grow even in the harshest soil of human cruelty and misunderstanding. 7 years had passed since that October morning when Jacob Whitmore first found a dying girl hanging from an oak tree in Devil's Canyon. Now, in the golden light of another autumn day, he stood beneath that same tree watching Kaya gather wildflowers for her betrothal ceremony. At 18, she had grown into a remarkable young woman, fluent in 3 languages, equally comfortable discussing Apache legends and territorial law, moving between worlds with the grace her grandfather had predicted. The tree itself had transformed beyond recognition. What had once been a symbol of hatred and death now bore fruit, its branches heavy with late-season acorns that Kaya gathered each fall to make traditional Apache bread. Nature had a way of reclaiming spaces touched by human cruelty, transforming them into something beautiful and life-giving. "The flowers are perfect," Kaya called out, her voice carrying the same musical quality that had first spoken her name in Jacob's cabin years ago. "Michael will love them." Michael Brennan was a young territorial surveyor who'd come through the ranch the previous spring to map new railroad routes. He'd stayed for dinner at Jacob's invitation and never quite left, drawn back again and again by Kaya's intelligence and Jacob's stories of redemption, by the unique peace that had settled over the Whitmore ranch. He was a good man, Jacob had decided after careful observation, someone who saw Kaya's Apache heritage as part of her strength rather than something to overcome or ignore. The betrothal ceremony would be small but significant. Chief Naeli and several Apache families had ridden down from the reservation, while townspeople from Copper Creek were coming to celebrate a union that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Doc Morrison would perform the territorial ceremony, Father O'Brien would provide the blessing, and Apache elders would conduct their traditional rituals. It was a wedding that bridged cultures, just as Kaya's life had bridged worlds. "Jacob," Kaya said, walking over with her arms full of desert blooms, "I need to tell you something important." The seriousness in her voice made him look up from the fence post he'd been repairing. Over the years, he'd learned to read her moods, to distinguish between everyday concerns and moments that truly mattered. "When I was hanging from this tree," she continued, "I thought my story was ending. I thought hatred had won, that there was no place in this world for someone like me." Jacob set down his tools, giving her his complete attention. They'd talked about that day before, but never quite like this, never with the weight of impending marriage and new beginnings hanging between them. "I was wrong," she said simply. "My story wasn't ending that day. It was waiting to begin. Everything good that's happened since, everything I've become, started with you choosing to see a child instead of an enemy." Jacob felt his eyes burn with unexpected tears. "You saved me too, you know. I was barely alive when I found you, just going through the motions of existence." "That's what I mean," Kaya said, reaching out to take his weathered hands in her smooth ones. "We saved each other, and now I'm about to start a new family, but I need you to know that you'll always be my father. Not because of papers or laws, but because of love." The word father still took his breath away, even after all these years. He'd never expected to hear it again after Ben's death, never imagined that love could grow in such unexpected soil. That evening, as the betrothal celebration began in the meadow below the cabin, Jacob stood again beneath the oak tree. The old wooden sign was long gone, rotted away or blown to pieces by desert winds. In its place, someone had carved words into the living bark, "Love grows here." Chief Naeli approached through the gathering darkness, moving as silently as ever. "She has become everything we hoped," he said, following Jacob's gaze toward Kaya as she danced with her betrothed, her laughter mixing with Apache drums and Irish fiddle music. More than we hoped, Jacob agreed. She's shown us all what's possible when people choose courage over fear. The old Apache leader nodded thoughtfully. In our stories, we say that some children are born to be bridge builders, to connect worlds that have forgotten how to speak to each other. Kaya is such a child, grown into such a woman. As the celebration continued under stars that seemed brighter than usual, Jacob reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The ranch that had once been a symbol of isolation had become a gathering place for Apache and white families alike. Over the years, word had spread about the man who'd saved an Apache girl, and other lost children had found their way to his door. Maria, a Mexican orphan whose parents had died of fever. Two Navajo boys whose reservation school had closed. A Chinese girl whose family had been killed in a mining camp riot. Jacob Whitmore, who'd once thought his capacity for fatherhood had died with his biological son, had discovered that the heart could expand to hold as much love as was asked of it. The Whitmore Ranch had become an unofficial sanctuary, a place where children of all backgrounds could heal from trauma and learn to trust again. The next morning, as the last of the wedding guests prepared to depart, Jacob walked one final time to the oak tree. Kaya and Michael would be leaving soon for their new home in the growing town of Albuquerque, where Michael had been offered a position with the Territorial Survey Office. They would visit often, and Jacob would never truly be alone. But this chapter of their story was coming to a close. As he stood beneath the fruit-laden branches, Jacob remembered the sign that had once hung there. "White man too wicked." The words had been meant as a final judgment, a declaration that some sins could never be forgiven, some hatred never overcome. But the tree itself told a different story now. Where death had once hung, life flourished. Where hatred had planted its message, love had grown deeper roots. The transformation wasn't magic or miracle, but the simple result of people choosing to plant seeds of kindness rather than sowing more hatred. Doc Morrison approached from the cabin, his medical bag in hand as always. "Ready to let her go?" he asked gently. Jacob smiled, watching as Kaya helped Maria pack supplies for the journey to her new teaching position in Santa Fe. "I'm not letting her go," he said. "I'm watching her fly. There's a difference." As the last wagons rolled away from the ranch, carrying his adopted children toward their various futures, Jacob stood on his porch reading the wooden sign Kaya had made for him years earlier. "Whitmore Family Ranch, all welcome." It was more than a sign. It was a promise, a declaration that this place would always be a refuge for those who needed one. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and the distant sound of children's laughter from the reservation school, where Kaya now taught during her summer visits. Somewhere in the growing darkness, the oak tree rustled its leaves, and Jacob smiled to think that what had once symbolized mankind's capacity for evil had become a testament to its capacity for redemption. Love had indeed grown here, taking root in the hardest ground and flourishing against all odds. And as long as there were people willing to choose compassion over cruelty, understanding over fear, that love would continue to spread across the territory like seeds on the desert wind. If you've been moved by Jacob and Kaya's incredible journey from hatred to healing, from despair to hope, smash that like button and subscribe to our channel. Tomorrow, we'll share another powerful story of unlikely families forged in the unforgiving beauty of the American frontier. These tales of courage, redemption, and the triumph of love over fear are waiting to inspire you. Don't miss a single moment of these extraordinary human stories.